Oh, hey, I think we're live. Um, so here we are. Winging It is a show by OddBird about web design development and our approach to solving problems. And today's show, we're going to discuss web features and baseline. I'm Miriam Suzanne, and with me is James Dookie Weber.
Hi.
Hey, James, do you want to kick us off by telling us what web features are?
Sure. Yeah, web features are kind of, as a concept, they're these units of things that you can do on the internet, things um, that it's helpful to talk about in some features of the internet in groups, things like relative colors, or things like the DOM, or things like the table element. These are all things that you can use on the internet, or you can embed things. You can use WebRTC. These are all features of the internet, and it's helpful to have a some sort of standard around those. Yeah, here's a this is a an attempt by the web platform DX community group to come up with a way of talking about web features in a standardized way. Um, for a lot of years, maybe you've talked about or used "can I use," for instance, to like, here is a group of features or something like that, or here's a thing that you want to use on the internet. And maybe as a developer, you haven't always thought about what are all the parts behind that? What are the pieces that power it? So it's not maybe just a single API surface or a single thing that you're wanting to use. It's let me just put on do not disturb. Great. Sorry about that. It's might not be just one thing that you want to use from the internet. It's a grouping of them. And so, yeah, the web platform DX community group on W3C has a web features folder. And I'll
So
quick.
is that like when you're saying a group with parts, is that like I don't know, we've got wide gamut color spaces could be a web feature, and then OKLCH, OKLab, and color are all parts of that feature.
Yeah, that's one way you can look at it, or slice that apart. And that's, I think we'll get into um, some of the challenges with how to represent those features. That's exactly it. How do you represent the breadth of the internet in a way that actually makes sense? And I think a lot of that is going to come out with how that makes sense is when you're working with or when as we're looking at how these are actually used, then I think it'll make sense. Okay, this is a feature. This is might not be a feature, etc. But yeah, this is the web features repository. It's been, I think, several year effort, but really has ramped up in the last few months, or over this year. It's really just ramped up as far as trying to um, make everything on the you can do on the internet a feature. Group everything, which is a huge order, huge task, and we're close. It's crazy, but we're close. Yeah, so a web feature, what it boils down to, in this web features repo, there's a features group or directory, and inside of that, there are many features. Each of these YAML files represents a feature. I'll kind of talk through what the YAML versus the YAML.dist is briefly. But for instance, if we're looking at border radius here, we have a name, border radius. I'll make this a little bit bigger. And close that out. We have a description, which is kind of a very brief, like, what is this thing? And then we have a link to the spec, a link to can I use, that kind of will show why that's helpful. There's status, which I'll get back to. And then there's all these compat features. So we're saying when someone is wanting to use border radius, they're curious, can I use border radius? They're going to be curious about all of these different things. For instance, can you use the the CSS property, border bottom left radius, border bottom right radius, border radius, top right radius, all of those things. And then also there's a lot of different nuances there. Can you use percentages for that? Can you use elliptical corners for that? Can you use 4 values for 4 corners, like the shorthand? And so all of those are coming from the browser compat data, which you might be familiar with from MDN. They have support tables on there on each thing. And so they define for each of these keys, what are the browser support? What is the browser support?
Do you want to show that on MDN?
Sure. Let's see let's go over to MDN border radius and see what we have here. So this the place where it most comes up is on these browser compatibility tables. So you can see border radius, what browsers it's supported on, for values for 4 corners, elliptical borders, percentages, etc. And so that's kind of how that's how that is all organized. And in essence, I think there's something like 13,000 BCD keys, browser compat data keys, that represent.
So the keys are like these individual rows in this table.
Yes.
And then web features is saying which ones go on which page, basically here, to some extent.
Yeah, yeah, to some extent. It's not being used for grouping. MDN is doing some custom grouping for these,
right,
for this part here.
But is it the same sort of thing?
Yeah. So so then how that is useful then is based because of this. These are the YAML files are what people define, what me as an author who's been working on some of these, what we do, or what you can do, what anyone out there can do, because this is an open source thing that is, only going to be as good as whatever everyone puts into it.
It's all being done manually.
Yes.
Yeah.
So then in this dist file, which is automated, there's some scripts that run and things like that, and it comes out and spits out, okay, this border radius, there's a baseline high, and so the baseline low date was 2015, high date was 2018, which is, you might have some questions about that, but that's because data only is good back to 2015.
Okay. Do you want to talk some about what is baseline? What does it mean to be baseline low or baseline high? What's that?
Yeah, so baseline high and baseline low. What that means is, so baseline low date is the date that every browser that is considered in this algorithm, the date that all of those have support for this feature. So that means border radius. Maybe we should go to a newer example. Container queries, for instance. If we look at this, on Valentine's Day 2023, container queries came out in all the browsers. It was available in the shipped versions of all the browsers. And that is a great way of saying, here's something you can play around with. Here's something you can work with. But then what's more useful is, when can I actually use this? And this is where baseline really is helpful. Baseline is essentially 30 months has passed, or baseline high is 30 months has passed since this date.
So that seems arbitrary. That's basically sort of a guess of, it's been around long enough that most browsers will have it.
It's a guess, but educated guess. They've looked at data from how people load browsers, how they update their browsers and things like that. And in general, it seems like within 30 months, the majority of people are on up-to-date browsers.
Right. I imagine that's sort of waiting long enough for like the slow release cycles of enterprise
Yeah,
update paths or something.
or out of date, or like old phones and things like
Right.
that might not. Yeah. And so I think there have been a lot of conversations actually before I joined the effort, really, as far as what is that baseline high? When do you can you say that that is true? I think there was a question on Mastodon from Pell Westman asking, will you cover the two current baseline denominations, newly available versus widely available, which is high and low, and how they differ from the original baseline definition? The original baseline definition was essentially supported in the last two major versions of the major browsers, and the new ones are supported in the latest version of the browsers, plus 30 months has passed. And they say, I find the new ones less relevant for me as a web dev. And that's kind of I think it's a fair question. What is, or yeah, how do you get to that 30-month date versus, or what do you get over the last two major browser releases? And part of that is release cadences are very different for different browsers. Safari is going to have, I mean, they're more tied to the operating system updates, so they're kind of going at their own cadence. Firefox is seems to be putting out quite a few. Chrome, quite a few, incrementing their version numbers. And what is a major version number?
Right, that's really the difference. All those browsers are releasing new features at a pretty regular rate, but they're setting version numbers very differently.
Yeah. So I think there's yeah, I think there were a lot of trade-offs and a lot of like, what is the best way of doing this? This is what they settled on based on talking with a lot of people and doing some research. And that doesn't mean that it's necessarily static forever, but it seems to be working for now.
Well, it seems to me to get to maybe one of the most valid critiques of baseline, or my concerns about it, which is like support is never on or off. And in a sense, what baseline is trying to do is simplify it down to yes or no. And like maybe that's a rough thing to do to start with. But it's also potentially helpful. I mean, because we see a lot of like people still not sure if they can use grids, and the answer is solidly yes. But yeah, people go a long time sort of not updating their knowledge of what support looks like. So yeah, to some extent, I would say there's always a like any answer here is going to be muddy at best.
It's going to be wrong some percentage of the time.
Right.
So so grid was out everywhere in 2017 and baseline high in 2020. And then we get down and see, sure, but it wasn't until 2023 that grid template columns repeat or rows repeat was available. So how do you compose those features in such a way that that you don't, or that if someone is targeting something, a browser from 2022 or something like that, still needs to support that for some reason, and they want to use repeat? How do you make that represent that here?
Right. So okay, so that's getting into a question about how do you group things? But before we get there, let's just talk a little bit more about like, okay, so which browsers are included here?
So it's defined currently as Firefox, Chromium, and Safari are the three that are kind of are what's. So Edge and Chrome make up Chromium and their mobile counterparts. So yeah, there you can see Chrome, Chrome Android, Edge, Firefox, Firefox Android, and Safari iOS. Those are the ones that are known, are included in this. And there was some questions. I think there's some ongoing questions about, is this too Eurocentric, too North American centric, of like, this is what is used by the people who, like, by people like me who are in this part of the world, and there are lots of browsers that are not listed here. It seemed like, in working with, or one answer I've gotten from people is they were talking to people or developers elsewhere, and they were also finding this list useful. And I think another part is a lot of those other browsers that we don't necessarily have historical support data for a lot of these things. So I think that's something to be, yeah.
Are those browsers on different engines, or are a lot of them reusing WebKit or Chromium or Gecko?
I suspect that there are a lot of reuse, but I'm not. I couldn't.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing that seems like it could be missing here, and Adrian Roselli has brought this up a lot, is accessibility data. There's not sort of documentation here. So a browser supports, say, display contents, but what does it mean to support it? Does that include supporting it in a way that's accessible and still giving the accessibility tree what it needs?
Yeah.
And that, I think that data is just not being tracked.
Yeah, it's not being, or there are some cases where I think probably where there's like concerted efforts around a certain thing, or there's bug reports or things that filter into BCD. Some of those things are being tracked. But yeah, one actually one site that you turned me on to was the accessibility support. So A11y support.io, that is somewhat similar to web features, but talks more about the accessibility. So this is kind of, could be a useful companion for web features.
Yeah, I think this fits in with the other critiques of sort of like, Can I Use also doesn't have this data, MDN also doesn't have this data, but it sort of becomes more of a problem if we're thinking of it as a yes/no answer, and then we're still missing some of this data. So yeah, in my mind, there's something about always providing caveats with yes/no answers on browser support. But yeah, still an interesting project to try to group web features.
Yeah.
So how are these being used? I mean, you showed that the BCD keys, the browser compat data, that's being showed on MDN.
Yeah. And so there you probably have seen them around the internet in a variety of places. They've been kind of getting integrated in a variety of ways. So on MDN, here at the top, we have this, they've added widgets here, baseline widely available for radial gradient, for instance. And that is being powered by the web feature repository. So those features are defined here. MDN is saying, okay, this page relates to this feature, because they also have to do that mapping of what's there. And so yeah, it might say baseline widely available. So it, all the browsers say they're available, or it might say baseline 2023 newly available. And so you'll see it there. And you'll also see it. We've also had added, Can I Use has added links as well. So for instance, right here, relative color syntax, we have, it's baseline 2024. And we're not on all, we don't have all of the features mapped, but we do have many of them. I think it's several hundred can I use keys are mapped to web features. So we can show that there, which is essentially one of the challenges on this project has been, how do we boil this very complex browser support data, down into this one yes no. That is essentially,
That's the whole question.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And how do we, I mean, we also had to be careful because we knew that Can I Use was going to be a consumer. How do we make sure that we agreed with their browser support? So, and because browser support isn't always a yes no thing, and like sometimes Can I Use was taking into account certain accessibility things or certain syntaxes or values that weren't necessarily taken into account by BCD. We've had to kind of figure out how to map those together. Yeah, so that's another place you might see them. Another place that you might see them that is just kind of popping up around the internet. Here's a great blog post from David Darns, just talking about some of the new things on the internet, and they're using the baseline status web component that is available, and you can. We'll share the baseline status web component itself as well, but very easy to just add in this updating availability chart for anchor positioning. So in 30 months or whenever anchor positioning is fully available, it will be updated here. So yeah, the baseline status web component has just a few different variations, and it's as easy as including it, and then you can just use that web component on your page, either via CDN or npm install, and that gives you, especially for people who are writing about new features and things like that, this is helpful to add to your blog post just to say we're good. Here's how it is.
Yeah, I'd be curious about other people coming up with other ways of displaying this data, right? Like,
yeah,
the data is available
mm-hmm.
in a public repo.
Yeah.
Clearly, they've got some API driving this web component.
Mm-hmm.
It probably wouldn't take a lot to make your own API if you wanted different
Mm-hmm.
representations of the data.
Yeah, 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 for sure. And yeah, I think you've done some work around let's see,
I've really just played with it briefly. I haven't solved anything. I think some of the questions I was interested in are like, what if you show visually where we are between newly available and 30 months, right? If we've got this sort of time tracking, what if we showed our progress along that timeline? But I haven't gotten much farther than that. I'm just sort of interested in like, how do I take this data
mm-hmm.
and add some more nuance back into it and
Mm-hmm.
say like 30 months is not a magic number. It's just like maybe a useful point that we can look at,
Yeah,
and think about where we are on some timeline. I don't know,
yeah,
but I'd be interested in sort of what other people come up with.
yeah, for sure. And I think that's one of the one of the current goals is by the end of the year to map the entirety of the web platform into web features. So that's kind of a sprint to that. But then I think we've seen how we author features, what data we provide when we know it's Can I Use, and MDN using this, and there's other consumers as well. But how I think as more use cases come up, there will be, hey, I want this nuance. I want to, I think currently included in the keys, it's not necessarily clear if there are some that are included that aren't quite baseline yet, or that we opted to say this particular syntax does not hold up the entirety of the feature or something like that. We don't necessarily have a way of showing that yet, but I think that'll be something that we'll need to figure out how to incorporate. Yeah.
Yeah. So what have you been doing? What has OddBird been doing on this?
Yeah. So I think, I mean, we have, for myself, Victor and Sandra, as well as you, Mia, we have been contributing to this web features project. Our goal has been that all the CSS related items in the web. And so, yeah, we've contributed, I should have pulled the numbers here, but I think several hundred features, and defining them and going through and describing them, naming them, making sure those make sense. Yeah, it's been a kind of a large ongoing project for the last few months, but it's been really interesting to kind of dig into all of these nuances, all of these parts of the platform that I sometimes kind of skim over when looking at things. But yeah, it's we've been making good progress. We're getting down to the really long tail of the. I think we have something like 50 or 60 keys remaining, and some of those we're just needing to say, oh, actually, this is bad data in BCD or something like that. We need to go into BCD and delete it, things like that. So
it's been a combination of working in web features and filing issues against the data itself. Is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. For instance, accidentally there were, I think, 40 some incorrect values for list style type. So like different marker styles for Amharic or Urdu or things like that actually aren't part of CSS spec, but somehow got in accidentally. Excuse me.
Right. It's something that some browsers provide, but is not officially spec'd.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, when you say that I've contributed, as a team, we've done hundreds of features, and I've done maybe 3. So I've dabbled, but you've been in there. Do you want to talk about some of the what's the complexity? What have you run into along the way?
Sure. I think I can stop sharing my screen for a bit, but I think one of the challenges has been what is a feature? So are we
central?
Yeah, it's really, it's kind of been evolving, and I mean, the majority of these features have I mean, they were, I think, starting really in earnest earlier this year. And as we've kind of evolved and things like that, the what is a feature has kind of shifted and changed. But one of the questions was, is this kind of like an MDN where there is a page on every single property, every single little thing, where it's documentation. Is it, or is it more of a changelog for the web? Here are the latest things you can do. Here is what is new. Here is what is interesting. Here is what you can do right now. And so those have been, I mean, it's kind of like, sometimes that's, I guess we've kind of leaned more towards it's a changelog. So if the web was something that came with a changelog, what would those individual items be?
Right. So then you might say subgrid, even though that's a part of a grid feature. It comes long enough later that you separate it out as its own feature because that's more useful in a changelog.
Yeah, exactly.
But also, you're not going as far as each individual key. I mean, that would be, we already have the keys.
Yeah.
The point here is to group them somehow.
Yeah. I think, yeah, and so that balancing act has just kind of been figuring out exactly like, well, for instance, I think I forget if I've given this example already, but the OK Lab, was introduced in May of 2023 to all browsers, but you couldn't use both. You couldn't mix percentages and decimal values initially, and that didn't come until August. So, is that something that is?
Are those separate features
Yeah,
then, or are they the same feature?
yeah,
And
and
then which number do you use
yeah.
for when it was supported?
Yes, that's the question. And I think a lot of times we've leaned, I think for that one, actually there's an open pull request for this currently, but it's, I think where I'm leaning is we can say probably the mixed syntax is not that crucial of a feature. It's not something that, one thing we often are looking for signals for how developers are using this. Are they talking about this on Stack Overflow? Are they writing blog posts about, hey, I can use percentages as part of OK Lab now? That's probably not going to happen that much. So for this case, I think we can just say those are later additions to the same feature. We're not going to separate
Right.
out a new
And the
feature.
feature was already supported. We don't have to
Yeah,
say that it wasn't supported until this came
yeah,
along.
yeah,
So you're sort of making a minor versus major distinction there. I mean, it's sort of like if you were thinking about releases for the web or something, or for each
yeah,
of these features.
yeah.
Is it a major change that requires a new name, or is
Mhm.
it a minor change that just updates the existing?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I imagine the other complexity could be that some things maybe group into multiple categories.
absolutely. Yeah, that's I'm trying to think of some good examples of that. Um, but CSS types, for instance, like
Mm,
we have BCD keys for like the concept of an integer type, or I guess a number type, or there were some ones that would like, this sounds interesting but is not actually used, like a frequency type, or a time type, things like, or time
oh
type
yeah,
is
time
used.
types are used. Those
Yeah,
are used in, yeah,
in
in
animation.
animations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh, so yeah, things like that. Um, do you put those into animations? Do you put those into transitions where
Right.
they're also used? Are they, do we have a type, like
Right.
a type feature? Do people care
Are
about the,
right.
yeah,
Are people Googling support for yeah,
yeah,
DuckDuckGoing or
yeah,
whatever?
yeah,
Support for uh CSS type
yeah,
frequency. Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
They're not. Yeah, and
Yeah,
well, not,
some of us might, but it's not a
I,
common thing.
I,
I
I had
just,
to,
I'm recognizing who we might have on the call here.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So I think figuring out where those all go, and currently we do have the hard limit that things have to go in one category, or in one feature.
Right.
I think probably down the road they'll figure out the tooling. I think there's some complexities around how to um, do do the many to many mapping where a key
Mm,
is in multiple fields. I mean, there's also things like the DOM representation of all the CSS values or something like that, or ways of interacting with CSS via JavaScript. Are those, I mean, like, I'm trying to think of an example, but is like the,
oh, like accessing container queries through a JavaScript API,
mhm, yeah,
is that part of some JavaScript feature, or is that part of the CSS feature?
for, for container queries, yeah,
Right. Is it? You're right. Yeah. Okay.
yeah. So
Huh.
there's a lot of that. I think um, my initial hope, my naive hope going into this was, okay, we'll have a lot of very similar features, everything is like, we did this feature like this, we'll do this feature like this, we'll do. I mean, they're all apples, and no, it's we've I think partially because we've opted to do the changelog for the web. We've like, okay, these really old like static well, let's see, yeah, or absolute positioning or relative positioning. We don't have to give that as much like as much of a feature. I think we group those together, perhaps. I forget exactly right now off the top of my head. But for newer things like fixed positioning, I'm trying to remember. That seems newer in my head. I think
I don't know. I would have to look at your data.
I know. Fixed positioning. This has actually felt like a superpower recently of just being able to like fixed positioning is very old as well. Or yeah, I can quickly dump everything. But yeah, I'm trying to remember. There was some positioning.
Where are you looking when you
Yeah.
do that? When you look to the side
Ha.
and immediately tell me fixed positioning, what are you?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the features repo,
Okay.
or web features repo, and so I found fixed positioning, and yeah,
Is there a front end for this anywhere?
yes,
Or
actually,
do you just go to the repo? Is that the only way to see it?
I go to the repo because I actually I have it open all the time locally, but there is a great Web Features Explorer repo that shows all of them. This is definitely a work in project or progress as far as how things are laid out, and there's I think a lot of good ideas on how we can use this data. But yeah, let's see. So we can see, for instance, we have done some grouping, some larger grouping of features. I think there's a positioning group, or that might be layout positioning. I'm trying to remember if it's sticky positioning. Sticky positioning was a little bit newer,
Yeah.
but and it looks like we did split apart absolute and relative. Just in that case, apples to apples didn't make sense. So apparently my example was incorrect, but I mean that's the kind of thing where like, or actually another one is CSS selectors. A lot of the selectors there's a lot of newer ones, and like the file selector button, or first letter, first line, those are newer. But what do you do with class and ID or lang
right.
or like,
is there some like CSS2 selectors, the original selectors? I don't know.
Yeah, that actually that is on my list of things to do today is
okay.
What do I call that grouping? So
Sure.
and one that doesn't.
So leave a
Yeah.
comment.
Yeah.
What should James call that grouping?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, okay.
But this also has some other interesting things like release notes for the web here. Excuse me. So yeah, you can see what the different things were added each month, and kind of drill into those to learn more. Look at newly available and widely available, and some of those change logs are really interesting there. So
I think they have an RSS feed for that too. You can subscribe to the release, to the like what's new.
They
what's
don't
changed
yet. I think there's an open queue for that, but a slightly different one, using a lot of the same things. Agalia, Eric Meyer, and others have a BCD Watch. I actually, I subscribe to this RSS feed. What's being added, removed. You can also see, what changes were made last week.
So that's if people want to track what you're doing day to day.
So this is not tracking what I do. This is this reflects what I mean. For instance, this reflects that Safari was added, or that page at rules were added to Safari And now that's in everything. So
right. So it's actually what's landed in browsers, not what you've put into features. That
yeah,
makes sense.
yeah,
That makes more sense.
yeah, yeah. So what? Yeah. So yeah, this is a great kind of parallel effort that has been helpful as well for
Sure.
tracking other things. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So I imagine as you work on this, you've run into features you didn't know about or anything interesting.
Yeah, I think one of them has been speech. This is currently only in spec form, and I think speak and speak as have some very limited support. I think one's in Safari, one's in Firefox, if I remember right.
Hmm.
But the idea of this whole draft as it comes is like, what do you do with or how can we describe the presentation of speech, of text as speech, or of your content as speech? So there's some things like voice volume, voice balance, some of the mixing things. The speak, I think, is just kind of like yes or no. Speak this. Speak as gets a little bit more interesting, especially around like list items or letters. Like, are we spelling these things out? Are there let's see, like if it's a list item, should I say each individual digit, or yeah, you have a
Oh,
little bit of
right.
control over that.
Yeah, I imagine also you need some control over like this is an acronym, read out the letters.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's interesting. I mean, having done a lot of like looking into the history of CSS, this was some of these things were proposed in the first email proposal for CSS. It was like, we'll probably need to style speech too. And then that never happened. There was even an oral style sheets spec that predates this one that browsers never implemented.
Yeah.
Um, and I think this is a new draft that Leonie Watson's been working on. Um, and she has an article about why we should have it. I mean, I think some of the concerns are, is it really okay to turn up the volume on somebody?
Hmm.
But I think she points out it's a real similar concern to, can we turn their font uh, too big or too small? And the answer is we have to give people ability to override uh,
Hmm.
the styles. But it's interesting to me, she makes very similar arguments to the early arguments for CSS, which is like the web is boring if you don't have styles.
Hmm.
And as a screen reader user, uh, not having any style, not having any variation on sites
Yeah.
um, is tedious.
Yeah. And I was fascinated how this matches or kind of mirrors other CSS or parts of CSS, like voice family kind of mirrors font family. Like, okay, I
Mm.
want this, I want to identify this type of thing. Or, I mean, you can change the rate, the pitch. The stress was kind of interesting. Like you can like which part of a sentence do you want to stress? That
Sure.
is something that is incredibly, I mean, something you lose a lot in text to speech. Um,
Right.
and,
And we do it with like an M or a strong tag and then we style it, but that's not
mhm,
showing up in how it's read by a screen reader.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, often we don't even style it with that, and we hope that our intention comes across in text. But I
Right.
mean, I think, yeah, there's a lot of nuance that could be added there. Yeah, and yeah, it's I I'm mostly putting this here because I'm like, yes, I want this. Please, let's interrupt 2026 maybe.
Oh
Um,
yeah, somebody should suggest it for interop.
yeah,
That'd
yeah.
be interesting. Are there any others? What else? What else have you run into?
Another one that's been interesting, and I admit that well, one of the things is I've just kind of gone down so many rabbit trails on, like, it's just like, oh, this exists. I have to. I mean, I made a demo on the Speak As property, and like I'm curious how this works, and I don't always have time to go down the rabbit trail as far as I want. So actually, Miriam, I'm wondering if you could explain calc size to me.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I haven't played with it a lot because calc size was proposed, and then there was another proposal that actually I think both have shipped in Chrome. Um, what is the other one called? The ability to interpolate size.
Yeah, I think it's interpolate size.
Yeah, so I mean the basic problem that we're trying to solve here is um, ability to interpolate between an intrinsic size and like min content or max content or auto,
Mhm.
which like who knows what the auto algorithm is doing? You could if you go read the spec, but it's complex. Uh, so we get one of those like values that is coming from the content in some way,
Mhm.
and we want to interpolate. I mean, if we're animating in, say, we might want to interpolate from 0, or if we're animating out, interpolate from 0 to auto or auto to 0. But then there's other use cases maybe where we just want to do some calculation like, I don't know, the min content or the larger of min content and 50% or
Oh,
something.
yeah.
I don't know if that's a useful case. Um, but we want to do some calculation that involves known numbers, percentages, pixels, whatever, ems, rems, and these intrinsic values that don't have a number.
Mhm.
So how do we start combining those? So in a lot of cases, if we're trying to do that animation, the interpolate size, you might want to look that up and make sure I'm right about what that is.
Yeah, there is the interpolate size is a property. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Um, so you can sort of just stick that on, and then your transitions start to work between 0 and auto.
Mhm.
But calc size gives you a little bit more control where you can say, I want to do a calculation using one of these intrinsic sizes. So it
Okay.
takes two values, and first you say, which intrinsic size am I wanting to look at? And that can be like min content, max content, fit content, or auto.
Mhm.
Maybe there's others. I don't have it in front of me. And then in the second value, you do a calculation using size as the keyword. Um, and it uses whatever you said first in that new calculation you've given. So I don't, offhand, I don't have a specific use case where I would want that one over the other one, but I imagine there's probably like next month I will get a design that I have to implement, and I'll be like, oh, you know what I need? um, so yeah, I'm curious about that. I'm excited to have it, but I don't have a demo in front of me.
And sadly, it's limited availability only in Chromium so far. So still
Sure.
a ways out, but still,
So something to play with in demos,
yeah,
or to ship as a progressive enhancement
yeah,
potentially.
yeah, yeah. And that actually that's one point, or leads into a point about web features, that a lot of what developer communication, or like writing about new features in CSS, um, I, I think has been like, what is the cutting edge? What is the newest thing? What is
Mm,
about to ship, or what is shipped in one browser, or maybe it's in all the browsers, and then in 30 months or whatever metric you're using to say this is ready, it's a little bit, there's not as much fanfare. It's not,
right.
we talked about this a while ago, and my brain is already on to the next thing that I can't yet use. And so
There's no conference dedicated to what shipped 2 years ago, two and a
exact
half years.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, it's how do we can we use this to say, as part of the changelog for the web, like, okay, let's write about things that are now baseline high. Let's talk about those things, not only use those, but actually make sure we're doing education about those, or maybe even in like the 2 months leading up to that, saying, hey, you're about to be able to use this. But that could be a good way of focusing efforts on, or even reframing efforts for people who are educating about the web, like what can we do now, or what can we actually use right now?
Right. Yeah, I pitch to conference organizers. I want to you can use this
Yeah.
conference. Can you use yes
Yes.
conference? Uh,
Yeah.
yeah. Although, I mean, I think it is always worth remembering that progressive enhancement's the thing, and it seems
Mhm.
like calc size, for example, seems like the sort of thing where, in a lot of cases, you could do a fairly simple fallback that's sort of, you know, not getting you exactly what you were looking for, but it's, you know, failing towards the minimum or failing towards the
Mhm.
maximum or whatever you decide. Um,
Yeah.
there's a lot you can do with things that aren't baseline at all.
Yeah. Or you can use things like OddBird's anchor position polyfill. Let
Sure.
let you use anchor position, or yeah, or
Right.
popover as well, and things like that. So yeah, um, there are that kind of thing. Yeah.
All right. Well, we've got a few minutes left here. Do you want to talk what's next for this?
Yeah.
Where are we at? What's coming?
Yeah, so we're close to being done with all the BCD keys being mapped. Where there's still new features shipping and things like that, so they'll keep coming. But I think we'll be done with that by the end of the year and have things, or
Done
like,
as in caught up with the
yeah,
past ones.
yes,
Yeah.
caught up with the past ones. And then the goal will be to get ahead of things and integrate into the spec process,
Hmm.
even all the way up to there, or even into. I heard this morning that I think Chrome developers or Chromium developers, to ship a new feature, will need to have a use counter that is tied to a web feature ID. So all their new features that are shipping will come with will be tied to a web feature ID. So that means that web features will continue to be created, and part of that one pipeline, and then also integrated into the other browsers as well. And yeah, thinking another focus next year for the community group that backs this, it's how do we integrate this into tooling? Could you link your code to ensure there's no non-baseline features, for instance?
Or at
And
least that you have a backup when you're using something that's
yeah,
not widely supported.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so there's let's see if there is a tool that is being worked on. I think it's going to eventually be moved over into. I'm not seeing a link here. Well, let's see. Or it'll eventually become part of the web feature or web
Hmm.
um, community group, web platform community group, that will basically use the baseline definition to create a browser list that's up to date. So it's a little bit more complicated than just 30 months, because there's because of how browsers release. So this will be able to create a browsers list that you can use in your project, and then that unlocks a whole world of opportunities for how you're using that. That's just using a naive baseline, but then you can say, I want to make sure that I'm or I want to polyfill these specific features, or how do you integrate those into your process? So
Right.
I think people will become more familiar with web features and baseline as it gets into their tooling and part of their everyday workflow as they develop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, I think one of the things that I would be really interested in, and I'm gonna pitch this to our audience specifically, um, is like this is a bunch of data, right? Like, um, you could come up with a different definition of baseline, and you could use the same data, and you could ship it. You could ship your own web component that has a different definition of support, um, and it's sort of like this is a tool for custom can I uses.
Yeah.
Uh, can I use? Um, yeah. So like, what do you want from a support tool?
Mm.
The web features project is sort of just grouping the data in consistent ways. What can you build with that? What
Yeah.
how would you want to see this data? I
Yeah.
think, yeah, build your custom elements.
Mhm. Yeah. And the web platform DX community group, I mean, I think I have that name correct. But yeah, they're focused on how can we improve the developer experience? How can we make sure people are educated well enough to deliver good quality experiences on the internet and have the information they need? Yes, that's exactly right, Seth. That's a great idea. Yeah, and depending on your use case, that you might want a much shorter window. If you know everyone using your product is in your office or in your company and has that up-to-date browser, that would make perfect sense.
Yeah,
I think there's a
I
lot of
also want to see the way you style your vintages analogy, and I'm hoping for sort of a wine mom t-shirt vibe in your design. We'll see.
Yep.
You got anything else, James, before we wrap this up?
I don't think so. Yeah, we'll share a lot of these links and have show notes, and yeah, feel free to explore and ask questions. And yeah, we're on Blue Sky, Mastodon, and we're open to questions. So
Yeah, open to questions and open to seeing your ways of using this data.
absolutely, yeah. Well,
Cool. Thanks a lot, James. It's been
yeah,
great talking to you.
for sure. Yeah, thanks.
All right. See you all.
Bye.